Okay, well, thank you all for joining me today. We're going to be spending all our time talking about the new feature related to entering payoffs in decision or values in decision trees, not necessarily at the terminal node, but at any node along the pathways. And we'll call this upstream payoffs. Um, so traditionally, I'm going to open up an older model. Traditionally, decision trees would have payoffs entered at the terminal node. So these terminal node payoffs would have to account for everything that happened along this pathway. Um, and what this new feature has to do with is entering payoffs along the way that are accumulated to these pathways. We are going to use a legal model here because this, unlike many of our software features that come out, this is not limited to healthcare. It's not a healthcare specific feature. It applies to all model types. So we're going to use a legal model, but the same thing applies to a healthcare model, and we will be opening a healthcare model later in the selection. So again, just a little bit of repetition here. This pathway, and notice we're using TreeAge Pro Business, and we're using this Legal Tree Simple model. This pathway represents a possible series of events. You could choose to litigate, you could prove negligence, and you could get high damages. And this would be the value of that pathway. And the values aren't exactly the same as the model we're going to use. But that is a little bit constricting to have to wait all the way till the end and have to worry about everything that happened along the way. What we're talking about in this model is the mechanism to be able to add values. They really are payoffs at any node, right? So when you choose to litigate, you immediately get this negative 100,000 that relates to the legal fees involved with litigation. And it doesn't matter what outcome from that litigation occurs, you still have to pay those legal fees. And then here we've proven negligence and there's $5 million of compensatory damages. That's no longer not affected by what comes in as punitive damages. So it makes sense to put these values back here because that's the natural place where they're accumulated. And in a healthcare model, you might have a treatment that happens here, and you can pay for that treatment here, and it can span out to all the downstream scenarios that emanate from that node. And that's really the whole concept of why we've done this, to try to allow modelers to associate and accumulate values at the points in their decision trees where those values naturally occur, and not have to wait until you get to a terminal node and still have to account for this legal fees at every one of these 4 terminal nodes that come from that. So that's what the feature is all about. And again, we're using TreeAge Pro Business and a law example here for now. It is right here and this example is also in the healthcare product. These legal examples are also in the healthcare product if you wanted to open that up right now. So let's take a look at that, at how you do that. Well, the first thing you have to do is you have to set it up, because set it up and configure the model to accept that kind of entry. Because typically you would, the default is the way it's always been. You enter those values at the terminal node. So to set it up, you go into Tree Preferences, and under Calculation, Payoffs, and there's this checkbox, Allow Payoffs Prior to Terminal Nodes, and that enables the feature. It will default to unchecked. So if you don't check this box, it's going to assume that you want to enter these things the traditional way at the terminal node. But if you check this box, it will do that. Another tree preference we want to look at is under Display Payoffs. I've also checked this box to show the active payoffs below the terminal nodes. So rather than have the traditional payoffs out here, like you see in the other tree, I'm going to open that in a second. They're all the payoffs at every node are displayed under the node, kind of like variable definitions, but they're not variable definitions. They're additions to the payoff. In contrast, if I look at this tree, those terminal node payoffs are out here after the terminal nodes. So those are the 2 tree preferences that you want. Another thing in the tree preferences that may be valuable to you is, do you want to see extra payoffs? Now, this model doesn't have additional payoffs, but lots of models do have more model outcomes than just the single one for a financial tree like this one, or cost and effectiveness for a healthcare tree. You might have other outcomes, and if you check this box, you would see those other outcomes as well. That's not new, but it's related to this viewing of payoffs. So now let's look at a little bit more of these details of how this works. So within the litigate strategy, there are 5 places where value accrues. The legal fees at the litigate strategy, right? The compensatory damages you get if you've proven negligence. There's no damages down here, so you can consider that a payoff, even though it's 0. And then the different values of the punitive damages. And every one of those has an entry. And how do you enter that data? Well, actually, before I do that, if we're talking about what the value of this outcome is, it's going to be the sum of all 3. So I will calculate this model several times, but if I calculate it, I should see negative 100,000 plus 5 million plus another 5 million should be 9.9 million. And there it is, 9.9 million. And this is 7.9 million because the punitive damages were smaller. And this one was even less because the punitive damages were even smaller. But it's a cumulative effect of all these entries made along the pathway, which culminate in the full value of the scenario, the full event pathway. So that's the way it works, and that's the way it's calculated. And we think that it's easier than waiting and having to put this negative 100,000 here, 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 and here. Now, it is cumulative in nature. So if you have something, I know I work with some attorneys that sometimes have models that have different weights of the damages in terms of like fault or no fault, depending on how that split is going to be done. If you have those things where this is not independent of what happens downstream, you probably wouldn't use this option. But usually they will be independent, and it's a nice clean way to enter that data. Okay, so now how would you enter them? Because typically when you enter payoffs, it's always been at the terminal node, and you just double click on the terminal node and there's your payoff entry. Well, that doesn't really work because double clicking, for upstream nodes, because if I double click here, it's just going to add another node, which I don't want. I'm just going to undo that. So what we need to do to enter that data is a new view called the payoffs view. And that payoffs view, although it should really be down here, I'm going to put it down here, that gives you the ability to enter the payoffs at any node that you want. So here's where I entered the 5 million. Here's where I entered the 1 million for this node. So it's specific to the node that you select, and it's not limited to the terminal nodes. So any node could have a payoff. Now, I don't think you could put a payoff. I'm not sure you'd want to put a payoff here, but maybe you would if you wanted to go to both strategies. But you can put them at any node in the model. Let's see, what else do I want to cover next? A good time to check for questions. Let me check for questions. Question is, so costs will always be entered as negative numbers, revenues, income as positive numbers. I would say no to that. That if this were a cost effectiveness model, which let me just briefly show that for a second. If I switch over to TreeAge Pro Healthcare, if this were a cost effectiveness model, the calculation method would be set to cost effectiveness, and you would have different active payoffs for the two through the calculation method. This is when you're using a single value, which is the net damages in this other model, and the net damages, we're using a single payoff, so we're adding the cost as a negative number in that case. But that would not change the way you're doing cost effectiveness models today. Okay, so now let's run the analysis again, and let's think about this. So we know that this should be 5 million, 10 million, 9.9 thousand, 3 million, 8 million, 7.9 thousand, and similar to that. And this one should be 0 minus the 100,000. So we calculate it, and there's all your values. And they do account for things that happen along the way. One thing that is a little bit confusing is the fact that we show the rollback values under here instead of the entries. It may make sense in the future to change this so we show either the entries or both, or maybe give you the option to show either one. But I just don't want you to think these are the entries. This is the rollback expected values coming backwards, in case like putting them everywhere is a little bit too much to see. So at a minimum, we're going to at least add EV to this so it's clear that that's not an entry, because when I turn rollback off, those are entries. And without changing the label, that can be a little bit confusing. But that change to at least add the EV will be coming very soon. So rollback really works the same. It's just the way you enter the payoffs is the different. So this value of 4.7 for expected value for the strategy is the weighted average of all the different scenarios that could occur within that strategy. And even if it's a healthcare model, it's the same thing. When you're evaluating a strategy, you're taking the weighted average of all the possible scenarios. You're just doing it separately for cost and effectiveness, and then presumably running cost effectiveness analysis. Now, one other thing that we added with this feature was the ability to run a decision tree pathway report. And this is something that healthcare modelers have specifically asked for in the past. And I'm going to run it for a strategy. So you don't run it back here. You pick a strategy. And I run analysis decision tree pathway report. And for those of you who've used Markov models in healthcare, you recognize this looks quite a bit like the Markov cohort analysis reports, except it doesn't have multiple cycles because it's not a Markov model. But it basically fans out all the nodes. In fact, let me put that over here, make myself a little bit more room, and you see all the nodes in the model, or at least for the strategy, over here are fanned out over here. And you can see the entries that we made along the way. So we had the negative 100,000 here, the 5 million or 0, 5 million, 0 here, and then the additional punitive damages here, here, and here. And sure enough, the value of the rollback out here is in the third column. So these columns here, this column here shows you the nodes. This path probability shows how likely it is that you'll reach that node. Right? If you choose litigate strategy, you get here, but there's only a 60% chance you prove the damages, and 40% chance you don't. And then within the 60%, the compound probability of reaching high punitive damages is only 15%. So the chances that the case ends up at this point is only 15% based on our model. 30% and 15% combine up to the 60% here, and then the 40% here, and now you got the 100%. So this is giving you the likelihood of reaching out to those things. And in a healthcare model, it would give you the likelihood that a patient would reach one of these outcomes. So then you've got your value entry, and the value entry is what we entered at those upstream payoffs, right? And then this is the weighted value entry. So this is how it contributed to the overall expected value for the strategy, right? So the 100,000, everyone got that. But of the 5 million compensatory damage, there was only a 60% chance of that occurring. So this is the weighted, and if you sum all these up, you end up with the full expected value for the strategy, 4.7 million. The last two columns reflect rollback coming back the other direction. They say these are the values at your terminal nodes, right? All your scenarios. So let me go and calculate again. 9.9 million, there's that one, right? 7.9 million, that's that one. 5.9 million, that's that one. It's all the different points in the model. It's just what are the rollback numbers. And I think that this may be valuable to people who get big trees, because when your tree gets too big to see on a single screen, you can't really absorb all the impacts on your expected value. So that's part of why this is put in place. And then the final column is basically just showing you the scenarios. It's only, notice the 4 terminal nodes, it's only displaying value at the terminal nodes, and it's saying, well, this was the value of the terminal node, this was the weighted likelihood of that scenario occurring, and if you use the weighted likelihood of those occurring multiplied by the value, now you return to the same value of the overall strategy. That this was the value of that scenario, this was the likelihood of that scenario, here's the weighted value of that scenario, and if you sum them all together, you get back to the 4.7 million. So we've felt for a long time that this type of reporting would be useful for decision trees, so people can get a better kind of consolidated view of what's happening in the tree. And that would be true for a legal tree, a business tree, a healthcare tree. Of course, if there were a healthcare tree, we wouldn't just be a single value. That's just the name for this payoff. There would be a cost, and there'd be 4 more columns for effectiveness. Before I continue, I'm just going to check for questions again. Can value be given variable names? Absolutely, you could use variables. In this simple legal model, I haven't used variables, but I'm going to shortly open up a healthcare model that does use variables, so we'll come right to that. Is there any discussion of this in the manual? Absolutely, there's discussion of this in the manual. If you just search for upstream payoffs, so if I go to the help and I search for Upstream Payoffs right here, entering Upstream Payoffs along pathways. And it's all described in detail in the manual. And you can also look at this webinar again once we get the recording up. So I think that's all for the questions for now. And now what I'd like to do is switch over to TreeAge Pro Healthcare here and open up a model. Well, I didn't totally prepare for that. I have this open already, so let me just open up the model. Webinars. Okay, so here's a simple healthcare model. This one does use variables, Louise, as you had asked about. So all these variables are in place, but the same tree preferences are set to do the upstream payoffs, right? So in the same way, we have payoffs having the upstream one, but now we have two enabled payoffs because the calculation method is cost effectiveness and it requires two active payoffs. Now I might have had additional outcomes, but I have my primary two outcomes in this model. And the display setup was set up the same way. And this is a simple training model that I use all the time. But how does this upstream payoff affect it? Well, here I've got the treatment was applied. It was radiation. The cost of treatment is applied regardless of the outcome of that treatment. So it makes sense to put that here rather than having that same value placed both here and here. And the same thing with this combined surgery and radiation treatment. I don't need to place that in two places. I can put it in one place. So it's exactly the same feature, exactly the same way that it's implemented. It's just in a different context of a cost effectiveness model with both the cost calculation method set to cost effectiveness and the use of variables. So I will roll back this model and you'll see this 50,000 reflects the cost of the radiation plus the cost of the follow-up treatment. So let me just back up track for a minute. Here's your cost of radiation, 30,000, and then your follow-up is 2,000 over 10 years. So there's another 20,000. So the 30 plus the 20, and that's how you end up with the 50,000 here. Whereas down here it was 30 plus 6, so you end up with 36. So in fact, in the same way as the other model, you are seeing these costs from the upstream nodes passed out to the scenarios that follow them. Okay, we just check for questions. Nope, no questions so far. And you can also run the decision tree pathway report. Now you don't run it here, you run it for a strategy. So if I run the decision tree pathway report, I see it's a very simple strategy. It's just 60-40, one thing happens or the other. But again, the 30,000 was accrued upstream and it passed into both of these nodes, whereas these were the values that were accrued at the terminal node at post-treatment. And I have 4 columns for the cost and 4 columns for the effectiveness. And if I had another outcome, I'd have another 4 columns. But everything here works the same as what we had gone through for the legal model. So there's not a lot to say there unless there's a question. But I do want to show you one more thing before we break, and that is a Markov model, because it's not only decision trees that you can put this in, you can also have upstream payoff in a Markov model. So this is kind of a hybrid model, right? So in this model, I have a cost of surgery, and this surgery was applied, and then you have a certain percentage of people who just die. They die from the surgery. So I don't need Markov for that. Like they pay for it, and unfortunately they have a bad outcome. But then the people who do have who survive the surgery also have to pay for the upstream surgery. But that needs to be passed into the Markov model. And it's passed into the Markov model regardless of what state they start in. Like if there were, 3 or 4 states that you could start in, it would be passed into all of them based on the percentage. So what I expect here is that's 50,000 to be applied directly to this terminal payoff, but also to be passed in as an initial reward, even though I didn't enter it here. So let's start with the rollback. And you can immediately see the 50,000 that came from upstream down to here. And let's also look at the cohort analysis report. And you see this 50,000, well, that reflects the 50,000 that was upstream at the payoff node. In fact, let me put it down here. It reflects the 50,000 that happened upstream as well as the half cycle corrected 1,000 for another 500. And that's how you end up with a total cost entry in stage 0 of the 50,500. The 50,000 from the upstream payoff for the cost of surgery, and the 500 for the ongoing follow-up costs. And of course, that doesn't happen in stage 1, 2, and 3. It's just one time at the upstream node. Again, if there were multiple starting states, it would be applied to all of them. And I think that concludes what I'm hoping to cover today. So I just wanted to open it up for any questions before we break. Any additional questions? I guess not so far. So anyway, I really hope that you're able to make use of this new feature. I think it in the right scenario, it provides a lot of value and makes your entry simpler. And I know that I've worked with quite a few healthcare analysts who've wanted this, and who've not wanted to wait to the terminal node. So I'm hoping that we've addressed their needs, and yours as well. Anyway, thank you all. I'll wait one more minute for question, but doesn't seem like they're coming in. So thank you again for your time. And if you need any help, don't hesitate to contact us via support@treeage.com. Thank you. Oh, I guess I had another question. Could the payoff be set at survive? Yes, absolutely, it could be set at survive. I don't think that would be a good idea because the surgery was back here. In this particular example, absolutely, it could be put here if there were, some immediate follow-up that went forward. But at this point, the initial cost was here. But yes, you could put it at any node, any upstream node. In this case, this is probably the most appropriate place. Okay, great. Thank you very much, and have a great day.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.